December 7th, 1941, was a date that forever altered the trajectory of modern history. The surprise Japanese attack on the peaceful American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was not merely a devastating military strike. It was a soul-crushing humiliation that shattered America's sense of invulnerability. Within hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in burning ruins. Thousands of service members were dead, and a shocked nation was plunged into deep despair for the Imperial Japanese Empire. It was a triumph of unmatched proportions. Tokyo's military leadership believed they had inflicted a fatal blow from which the United States would take years to recover. Celebrations filled the streets of Tokyo, and the pride of the Japanese High Command reached unprecedented heights. They held an unshakable belief that their sacred homeland and the palace of Emperor Hirohito were utterly untouchable and impenetrable fortress, surrounded by vast oceans that no foreign power could ever cross. Yet, amid this dark hour of grief and humiliation, a fierce resolve was taking root in Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood a crucial truth about warfare. Conflicts are not won solely by bullets and steel, but by psychological dominance and morale. America desperately needed a bold stroke to restore its broken national pride and shatter Japan's sense of absolute security. Roosevelt issued a direct, seemingly impossible mandate to his top military commanders: find a way to strike at the heart of Japan. Bomb Tokyo. The directive baffled senior U.S. military planners. In early 1942, the United States possessed no air bases in the Pacific close enough for land-based bombers to strike Japan and return. Japanese forces controlled key Pacific islands, keeping the Japanese mainland thousands of miles beyond American reach. Moving U.S. aircraft carriers close enough to launch short-range naval fighters was deemed suicidal. Japanese long-range reconnaissance patrols and heavy naval assets would spot and sink the American fleet long before it reached the launch threshold. The problem appeared insurmountable. Then, in January 1942, a radical concept emerged. Captain Francis Lowe, a U.S. Navy submarine officer, noticed that the twin-engine medium bombers of the Army Air Forces possessed wingspans that could potentially clear the flight deck of a Navy aircraft carrier. He presented a wild idea to Admiral Ernest King. Could heavy Army bombers be loaded onto an aircraft carrier, transported within striking distance of Japan, launched off the carrier's deck, fly over Tokyo, and continue onward to land at friendly airfields in Allied-controlled China? On paper, the plan bordered on madness. Army bombers were never designed to operate from the cramped pitching deck of a ship at sea. They lacked the required short takeoff capability, and their fuel capacity was drastically insufficient for such distances. To pull off this high-stakes gamble, the military turned to a legendary figure, Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was not just a military officer. He was a pioneer with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, a world-class test pilot, and a fearless aviator. Fully aware of the catastrophic risks, Doolittle volunteered to lead the mission. He selected the B-25 Mitchell twin-engine medium bomber for the task. However, to make a land-based bomber launch from an aircraft carrier deck, the aircraft required radical modifications at a secluded airfield in Florida. Doolittle and a hand-picked group of volunteers worked around the clock. The B-25s were stripped of every ounce of non-essential weight. Heavy defensive armament, radios, and liaison gear were ripped out. Fake wooden guns were installed in the tail cones to deter enemy fighters. Every kilogram mattered. Range was the ultimate challenge. So specialized auxiliary fuel tanks were fitted inside the fuselages, turning the bombers into flying. Highly volatile fuel depots. Training was conducted under strict secrecy. The crews were taught the precarious art of pulling a heavily loaded B-25 into the air in a mere 500 feet a distance marked out on a runway to simulate a carrier's flight deck. A single miscalculation meant plunging straight into the ocean. In early April 1942, 16 modified B-25 bombers were hoisted by crane onto the flight deck of the newly commissioned aircraft carrier USS Hornet at Alameda, California. On April 13, 1942, the USS Hornet, accompanied by a small escort task force, steamed out into the rough waters of the northern Pacific under absolute radio silence, carrying 16 bombers and 80 daring airmen into the unknown. As the task force plowed through freezing sprays and violent swells, Doolittle gathered his 80 men below deck and revealed their true destination. "Gentlemen, our target is Japan. We are going to bomb Tokyo." A surge of adrenaline replaced the tension. The desire for retribution burned hot among the crew. But as the ships neared the Japanese home islands, the operational window narrowed dangerously. Japan had deployed a perimeter of armed picket boats hundreds of miles off its coast to warn against an approaching enemy fleet. The entire American plan hinged on total surprise. If detected early, the task force would be swarmed by Japanese naval and air forces, turning the mission into a catastrophe. By the evening of April 17th, the task force was approximately 800 miles off the Japanese coast. The original plan called for the USS Hornet to close the distance to within 400 to 500 miles by the evening of April 18th, launching the bombers under cover of darkness so they could strike Tokyo at night and reach China by morning. Fuel calculations had been made to the precise gallon. Any additional distance meant the bombers would run dry over the ocean short of the Chinese coast. However, war rarely obeys human schedules. On the early morning of April 18, 1942, through heavy mist and churning seas, an unexpected encounter unraveled the meticulously timed plan, pushing 80 American airmen straight to the brink of disaster. Just before dawn on April 18, 1942, a lookout aboard the USS Hornet spotted a shadow on the horizon. A Japanese armed picket boat, the Nito Maru, was riding the waves just a few thousand yards away. Before American escort ships could sink the vessel, the Japanese crew flashed an urgent warning to naval headquarters in Tokyo. American aircraft carriers sighted 650 miles east of Japan. The American commanders faced an agonizing dilemma. They were still more than 170 miles farther out than their planned launch point. Launching B-25s from this extreme distance meant the crews would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching safe havens in China. Aborting the mission, however, meant abandoning America's best chance at a strategic counterstrike and exposing the carrier fleet to immediate Japanese retaliation. Colonel Jimmy Doolittle did not hesitate. He looked at the churning seas, then at his men. The choice was made. He gave the order, launch the planes. The situation was sheer chaos. The USS Hornet was pitching wildly in gale-force winds and towering waves, spray-washing over the bow. The bombers were being launched 10 hours ahead of schedule and hundreds of miles short of their target line. Every pilot knew they were flying into battle with a 200-gallon fuel deficit. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the lead B-25, the twin, right? R-2600 engines roared to full power. As the ship's bow rose off a massive crest, Doolittle released the brakes. The heavy bomber lumbered down the short, wet deck, dipped dangerously close to the whitecaps at the bow, and then clawed its way into the gray sky. Cheers erupted from the ship's deck crew. One by one, all 16 B-25 bombers successfully took off into the tempest, skimming the waves at low altitude to evade Japanese radar. The 16 bombers set a direct course for the Japanese mainland. After 4 grueling hours of nerve-wracking flight, the coast of Honshu appeared on the horizon. In Tokyo, it was a clear, quiet Saturday afternoon. Citizens strolled the streets, children played, and military authorities operated with absolute composure, unconcerned about any potential threat. When low-flying, twin-engine aircraft appeared above the city, many onlookers assumed they were conducting a routine Imperial Japanese Army Air Force exercise. It was unthinkable that enemy bombers could be flying overhead at 12:30 p.m. The illusion of invulnerability shattered. Doolittle and his air crews unleashed their payloads over designated military installations, factories, docks, and oil storage facilities across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Explosions rocked the capital. The bombs dropping from the skies over Tokyo carried limited physical weight, but their psychological impact landed with the force of a seismic wave. Air raid sirens wailed frantically across the city. Anti-aircraft batteries fired wildly into the sky, and Japanese fighters scrambled. But the raiders had already delivered their blow and dropped back down to treetop level to escape out over the coast. The physical damage inflicted by the raid was modest, but the psychological shockwave reverberated through every level of the Japanese government and military hierarchy, leaving Japan behind. The 16 bombers turned southwest toward China, entering a race against time and fuel gauges. As night fell, severe storms swept across the East China Sea. Heavy rain and thick fog obscured the coastline, and the aircraft were running on fumes. Because the launch had occurred 10 hours early, the homing beacons in China were not operational, and no ground crews were waiting to guide them in. One by one, the engines starved of fuel and sputtered out. Lacking visibility and with fuel tanks empty, the crews were forced to either bail out into the pitch storm-swept night or make perilous crash landings along the rocky coast and mountainous terrain of occupied China. Standing in the mud in the dark, he was convinced the raid had been a disaster. All 16 aircraft were lost, and he feared he would face a court-martial upon returning home. However, against extraordinary odds, 73 of the 80 crew members survived the bailouts and crash landings. Local Chinese villagers and resistance fighters risked everything to shelter the American airmen, hiding them from hunting Japanese patrols and smuggling them to safety. The Japanese reprisal against the Chinese population was brutal and devastating. In the months that followed, Imperial forces launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, devastating entire towns and killing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for assisting the raiders, despite the heavy losses of aircraft. The Doolittle Raid achieved its strategic purpose beyond all expectations. When asked by reporters where the bombers had launched from, President Roosevelt famously smiled and replied, "They came from our secret base in Shangri-La." The shock of the raid threw the Japanese high command into turmoil. Their worst fear had materialized. The home islands were vulnerable to American air power. Panicked over the security of the emperor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto rushed force a decisive battle with the U.S. Navy to eliminate the remaining American aircraft carriers once and for all. This desperate push directly triggered the Battle of Midway in June 1942. There, the ambushed Japanese Navy lost 4 of its fleet carriers, shifting the strategic balance of the Pacific War permanently in favor of the United States. Jimmy Doolittle, who had feared disgrace, returned home to a grateful nation. He was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt. The Doolittle Raid proved that wars are fundamentally decided not just by tonnage of steel or numbers of troops, but by audacity, adaptability, and the will to strike when the enemy feels most secure. It was the masterstroke that shattered Japan's myth of invincibility and sparked the long road to Allied victory in the Pacific.